It was the kind of winter night Spokane knew too well. Wind cutting through the narrow streets, the hum of streetlights trembling in the cold. Snow clung to the edges of parked cars, and the downtown district had long emptied after midnight. It was March 4th, 2000. A night that should have faded like any other, except it didn't. Jessica Monroe left her friend's apartment on 5th Avenue around 12:45 a.m. She was 23, working as a nurse's aide at Sacred Heart Medical Center. Her shift schedule had been rough that week, and she was exhausted, ready to crash at home. The distance between her friend's apartment and her own was less than 7 blocks, less than a 10-minute walk. But Jessica never made it. At first, nobody noticed. By morning, her absence was shrugged off. She could have stayed over with friends or decided to sleep in. But by that evening, when she missed her shift at the hospital, something she never did, alarm bells went off. Her roommate, Angela, called her phone again and again. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. No answer. Jessica's silver Honda Civic was still parked outside their apartment. Her purse was inside the living room. Her coat, the thick black one she never left without, hung by the door. But Jessica was gone. By the following day, her family filed a missing person report. Her mother, Carol Monroe, drove from Coeur d'Alene in tears, clutching the last photo she'd taken of her daughter, Jessica, smiling at a Thanksgiving dinner table just 4 months earlier. Carol's voice trembled as she spoke to officers. She wouldn't just disappear. Not her. The Spokane Police Department assigned 2 detectives, Dan Keller and Maria Lopez, to the case. Both seasoned in missing persons, they started with the basics, retracing Jessica's route, interviewing friends, and reviewing security footage from nearby convenience stores. But in 2000, surveillance cameras were a luxury few businesses had. There were no cell tower pings, no tracking apps. It was an investigation built on legwork and instinct. Detective Keller, in his late 40s with a face carved by years of graveyard shifts, believed she was abducted. He had seen patterns before, young women vanishing on their way home, the marks of someone predatory and patient. Lopez, methodical and cautious, tried to keep things open. "We don't have a crime scene yet," she reminded him. "Right now, she's just missing." 3 days later, that changed. A jogger stumbled upon something near the riverbank, half a mile north of downtown. It was Jessica's shoe, a brown leather boot, caked in mud, missing its lace. Nearby, tangled in dry weeds, police found a torn scrap of fabric matching the shirt Jessica had been wearing. The discovery shifted everything. The area was quickly taped off, crime scene techs combed through the snow-dusted ground, and the tone of the case turned grim. Over the next week, volunteer searches expanded across city parks, alleyways, and wooded trails. Helicopters scanned the riverbank. Divers were brought in. Every day that passed felt heavier, fed by a sickening mix of hope and dread. Local news outlets ran nightly segments, interviews filled with flickering candlelight vigils, posters of Jessica's face everywhere you looked. Then, as quickly as she disappeared, the case went still. No body, no suspect, no clear answer. Weeks bled into months. Leads dried up. Jessica's friends were interviewed again and again, her ex-boyfriend, her co-workers, her neighbors, but nothing stuck. Theories surfaced, a stalker, a co-worker infatuation, a random act of violence. But nothing led anywhere solid. Her family clung to a faint hope she was alive somewhere, afraid, waiting. The police, however, began to suspect what everyone feared. By summer 2000, the case file had grown thick. Dozens of reports, interviews, analysis sheets, all ending the same way. No new evidence. Detective Keller refused to close it. He pushed forensics labs for trace tests, begged neighboring precincts for overlaps with similar cases. When nothing came back, he stored the box in his office corner, marked it with a red tag. Monroe, Jessica, active. But years passed. Spokane changed. Cases came and went. And Jessica's name slowly faded from public memory. 2 decades later, something unexpected stirred the silence. In March 2020, during a routine audit of unsolved cases, Spokane PD's cold case unit reopened several files, one of which was Jessica Monroe's. Technology had evolved dramatically since 2000, and the Washington State Crime Lab had begun reprocessing old evidence using advanced DNA extraction techniques. Among the items resubmitted, a single strand of hair found on Jessica's torn fabric and the shoelace recovered by the river. The lab report came back 3 months later. A partial male DNA profile had been developed, strong enough for entry into CODIS, the National DNA Database. It matched. The profile matched a man named Thomas Beckett, then 48 years old, living quietly on the outskirts of Spokane Valley. Beckett had no prior violent convictions, but he'd been arrested years prior for theft and served minor probation. What startled detectives was his old address, less than half a mile from where Jessica disappeared. Detective Laura Pence, now leading the cold case unit, revisited every page of the Monroe file, every detail. She found Beckett's name once, buried in an old witness list from 2000. He had worked part-time as a mechanic at the Chevron near Jessica's walking route. At the time, he told officers he'd seen nothing unusual that night. His statement lasted only 2 paragraphs. The reappearance of his name, now tethered by DNA, made Pence's pulse quicken. They quietly began surveillance, Beckett's movements, his routines. They collected discarded items, coffee cups, cigarette butts, grocery bags. Each new sample returned the same genetic match. On a Monday morning in 2021, 2 decades after Jessica Monroe's disappearance, detectives closed in. Beckett was arrested outside a hardware store, confused and defensive, claiming innocence. But when told the evidence linked him to the fabric and shoelace, his face drained of color. Inside the interrogation room, Beckett initially denied everything. Then, under the cold fluorescent lights, cracks began to show. Detectives pressed details, timeline inconsistencies, the forensic evidence. Hours stretched on. Slowly he started talking. Not a confession, not yet, but fragments of truth emerging from years of silence. In the end, after 21 years, the truth about what happened to Jessica Monroe would shake Spokane like an earthquake. The arrest would divide the community, those relieved, and those who couldn't believe one of their own had kept such a secret for so long. But that revelation, and the devastating confirmation that followed, would come later. For now, in hindsight, that March night in 2000 still stands like a haunting snapshot, the last moment anyone saw Jessica alive, walking beneath the flickering glow of a streetlight 7 blocks from home. The next chapter would finally uncover what happened on that walk, and how one small town's sense of safety unraveled with a single disappearance that refused to fade. The Spokane River is rarely still. Even in the quiet months, it moves with a steady, restless current flowing past the heart of the city, beneath bridges, between parks, and into the damp outskirts. Locals often describe it as a mirror of Spokane itself, beautiful and cold, capable of hiding more than it reveals. That same river had carried thousands of secrets through the years, but none felt as haunting as what it had kept buried since March 2000. After Thomas Beckett's arrest in 2021, detectives knew they were still missing one piece: Jessica Monroe's remains. The arrest revived old memories across Spokane. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, newspapers reopened archives, and locals who'd once volunteered in 2000 now shared stories of that long, hopeless search. The Monroe family, gray-haired but resolute, stood at the center of it all. Carol Monroe, now in her 60s, reopened the same box of photographs she'd once used for missing posters. "We finally have a name," she told the cameras, her voice breaking. "Now, please give us the rest. Bring her home." For investigators, that became the mission. Finding Jessica's body wasn't just about confirming guilt. It was about closing a wound that had bled for 21 years. Detective Laura Pence led the new search team. She was younger than Keller had been when he took the case, but carried the same grit. She grew up in Spokane, remembered seeing Jessica's missing posters as a child. This case was more than professional. It was personal. Her first order was simple but ambitious. Re-examined the riverbank, using modern ground-penetrating equipment and sonar. Over the following weeks, teams combed through frozen soil, sections of river path, and wooded stretches north of downtown. Local agencies volunteered manpower, students donated time, and a private drone operator volunteered to scan for unusual soil patterns along low-water areas. The Spokane Chronicle covered every update, rekindling a citywide attention that had long burned out. Then, after weeks with no progress, something surfaced, literally. On the morning of May 8, 2021, the river's current slowed near Peaceful Valley following a brief drop in water level. A team operating a search drone noticed an unusual metallic glint deep within a narrow water pocket near the embankment. It looked like a car door, half buried in silt and branches. Within hours, divers were in the water. What they pulled out stunned everyone. It wasn't Jessica's Honda Civic. Hers had been found years earlier at home. This was an early 90s Toyota pickup with its plates removed, doors rusted, half submerged for what appeared to be decades. Inside the cab, beneath layers of sediment, investigators found a faded hospital ID badge, the name nearly erased by time, but still faintly legible. Jessica Monroe. Tests confirmed it. The badge had belonged to her. The truck was the missing link, a ghost vehicle connected to no active registration, but registered in 1998 to one name, Thomas Beckett. When confronted, Beckett initially insisted the truck had been stolen years before Jessica vanished, that he'd reported it and written it off. Records did show a theft report, filed suspiciously 2 days after Jessica disappeared. The coincidence hit detectives like a hammer. Investigators dug deeper into Beckett's life from around that time. Employment records revealed he'd worked late-night shifts near 2nd Avenue, close to where Jessica last walked. Coworkers described him as quiet, solitary, the kind of guy you don't notice. One recalled Beckett mentioning walking women, late-night commuters, in a tone that made her uneasy, though she hadn't thought much of it back then. These fragments built a chilling silhouette of a man who'd moved unnoticed among the people of Spokane for decades. As forensic teams processed the truck, new physical evidence emerged. A length of nylon rope wedged beneath the backseat. Fragments of clothing fibers matching Jessica's. But it was what they found in the truck bed that changed the case entirely. Traces of human bone embedded in the rusted metal. They were small, fragmented, but enough for analysis. DNA confirmed it belonged to Jessica Monroe. The discovery broke the story open. The evidence connected Beckett's vehicle, his DNA, and the victim all into one chilling timeline. For the first time in 21 years, there was scientific proof that Jessica had not simply vanished. She had been abducted, transported, and most likely killed the night she disappeared. News of the discovery traveled fast. Local media exploded with coverage. Aerial shots of the river recovery site. Frozen interviews replayed from the archives, contrasting then and now. People who had once marched with candles in 2000 gathered again, this time older, quieter, standing together as Spokane relived its darkest memory. Detective Pence knew the case needed a confession to secure a conviction. For days, Beckett remained silent, sitting in county jail, only speaking to his public defender. Then, after 5 days of interrogation attempts, he suddenly requested to talk, but only to Pence. The conversation lasted nearly 6 hours. Under the sterile light of the interrogation room, Pence allowed silence to fill the gaps. Beckett stared at his hands for most of it, pale and betraying small tremors. Then he started talking, haltingly, brokenly. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said, eyes fixed on the floor. "She was just walking. I stopped to offer a ride. She looked scared. I just wanted to talk." His words unraveled slowly. He described an argument near the river, a panic, a sudden fight. He claimed it was an accident, that Jessica fell and hit her head, a story that didn't fit the evidence. Pence didn't interrupt. She just let him speak. Eventually, she leaned forward, voice calm but heavy. "Then why covered up Tom?" she asked. "Why hide her in your truck? Why lie for 20 years?" He had no answer, just a stare that seemed to carry years of silent weight. "Because I couldn't undo it." With that statement, Beckett was formally charged with first-degree murder. The trial that followed drew crowds like Spokane hadn't seen in decades. Every day, photographers lined the courthouse steps. Old neighbors, old friends, even people who'd barely known the Monroe family came to witness what they saw as long-delayed justice. Inside the courtroom, The air was thick with the kind of silence that only grief can bring. Prosecutors presented the DNA evidence, the recovered items, the vehicle, the inconsistencies in Beckett's story. His defense fought to frame it as manslaughter, painting him as a man haunted by an accident, not a killer. But witnesses from his past painted a darker picture of a man with violent temper, who often followed women home after work when he was younger. When Carol Monroe took the stand, the courtroom barely breathed. She spoke plainly, without hatred, but every word carried the weight of 2 lost decades. "I wanted to believe Spokane was a safe place," she said. "Now I know I was wrong, but I still want to believe people can care enough to fix what's broken." After a 5-week trial, the jury deliberated for 2 days. On the 3rd, they returned with a verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom didn't erupt or cheer, it just exhaled. Carol wept quietly as the judge read the sentence: life in prison without parole. Outside, Spokane felt both relieved and hollow. Closure, yes, but no sense of celebration. Only the feeling that justice had come too late. At the riverbank that summer, a small plaque was placed near the site where Jessica's badge had been found. It read simply, "Asterisk in memory of Jessica Monroe, 1977 to 2000. Gone, but never forgotten, asterisk." Detective Pence visited that plaque often in the weeks that followed. Standing there, she thought about how easily time can silence pain, and how powerful one truth can be when it finally breaks through all the noise. The water moved quietly beside her, as if the city, at long last, could rest. But just as peace settled in, an overlooked detail in Beckett's confession would reopen questions no one expected, setting the stage for one last, shocking twist in the Spokane case. Even after the verdict, something lingered. Detective Laura Pence couldn't shake the feeling that Beckett's story didn't add up. Yes, the DNA, the truck, and the confession told most of the truth, but not all of it. There was still an hour that didn't fit, a missing window of time between 12:50 and 2 a.m. on the night Jessica disappeared. The gap bothered her like a splinter under the skin. For most, the case was over. Spokane could finally move on. But Pence, meticulous and driven by instinct, kept returning to the transcript of Beckett's confession. One phrase kept replaying in her mind, the moment he told her, asterisk, she was scared of someone else. "I remember that. Someone in a dark car, parked on the corner before I picked her up." Asterisk. No one had followed up on that claim. It was dismissed as an attempt to deflect blame. But the way he said it, not defensive, not manipulative, just matter-of-fact, made her pause. If there really had been another car, another set of eyes on Jessica, the investigation might have missed something critical. A week after the trial, she went back to the evidence locker, where every box and folder from 2000 was stored. Dust clung to the air as she opened the Monroe file, the same one Keller had refused to close years before. Inside, there were pages of witness interviews, old photographs, a grainy map of Jessica's route home. And then one note stood out. It was dated March 6, 2000, 2 days after Jessica's disappearance. A resident named Harold Winters, who lived near 5th and Jefferson, had reported hearing a woman's voice raised, arguing with a man near a dark-colored vehicle. Police had followed up once, but noted insufficient detail. Winters had moved away by 2002, and the lead went nowhere. Pence frowned. The vague report matched the time of Jessica's walk, minutes before she vanished. And the car description, dark, possibly blue or black two-door, was nothing like Beckett's old gray pickup. She reopened the timeline, laying out every verified event. At 12:45 a.m., Jessica left her friend's apartment. Between 12:50 and 1 o'clock, she should have passed 5th and Jefferson, where that voice was heard. Beckett claimed he met her closer to 110 along 2nd Avenue. That still left a full 20 minutes unaccounted for. What if Beckett's version wasn't the whole story? What if he intercepted her after something else had already happened? She drove to the neighborhood herself, retracing Jessica's path 21 years later. The street had changed, new apartments, repaved sidewalks, LED streetlights, but the slope of the hill and the way sound carried hadn't. Standing where Winters once lived, Pence looked toward the intersection. The memory of what had happened there, or almost happened, seemed to hang in the cold air. Back at the department, Pence requested access to archived 911 recordings from that night. Most had been purged, but two remained. One logged at 12:58 a.m. The call lasted only 12 seconds. A hang-up. The operator log noted, female breathing, crying faintly, no response. Line disconnected. The dispatcher never traced the call. Cell technology was primitive then, and without a callback number, it became another unsolved footnote. Pence sat back in her office chair, heart pounding. The timing, the location, the tone, it all lined up. Could Jessica have tried to call for help just before Beckett even arrived? She needed confirmation. There was one person left who might know, Detective Dan Keller, long retired, now living outside Spokane. She called him that evening. "Laura Pence," he said, his voice aged but still sharp. "Didn't think I'd hear from anyone about Monroe again." She told him about Beckett's confession, the recovered truck, the conviction. He was silent for a while, then sighed. "I always knew it was someone local," he said. "But you wouldn't be calling if that's all." "It's the missing hour," she replied. Beckett mentioned another car. "And there was a 911 call from that time frame. I think we missed something." Keller chuckled dryly. "That case haunted me for half my career. If there was something else, it wasn't in our evidence then." "But it could be now," Pence replied. Her tone had that quiet certainty Keller remembered well from younger investigators, still burning with conviction. Keller paused, then said something that made her heart tighten. "There was a rumor at the time about another man. Someone we looked at briefly. A volunteer from the search teams, named Eric Dalton. Lived near the route. Seemed too eager to help." Pence's pen froze mid-note. "Why wasn't he pursued?" "Because he had an alibi," said Keller. "Said he was working a security shift that night at a warehouse down by Spokane Industrial. Time cards backed him up. But," he hesitated, "you should know. He was Beckett's co-worker for a while." The connection felt like static down the phone line. Two men working the same gas station, both in proximity to Jessica's route. One caught, the other forgotten. Pence thanked Keller, hung up, and pulled Beckett's old employment file from storage. There it was in black and white. Assistant mechanic, Eric Dalton. The next day, she requested Dalton's record from SPD's database. Nothing alarming, a few traffic citations, no criminal offenses. He'd moved to Oregon years ago. But buried deep in his file was a curious note. One linked to the disappearance of another woman in 2003 from Pullman, never solved. Dalton had been questioned there too, but released for lack of evidence. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a pattern. Within 48 hours, Pence coordinated with Oregon authorities to locate Dalton. He was found living outside Eugene, working nights as a facility manager. When detectives arrived with a warrant for a DNA sample, he didn't resist. He even joked nervously, "This about that Spokane mess?" That was ages ago. But when a sample came back, it wasn't a match to Jessica's crime scene. Not identical, but partial. Old records from 2000 had degraded, but one diminutive trace on Jessica's fingernails contained alleles consistent with a close biological relative of Dalton's. Pence followed the line all the way down to the record of Dalton's younger brother, Marcus, deceased since 2005, in an apparent suicide tied to financial troubles. But the timeline of his life placed him squarely in Spokane during the spring of 2000. The river had given up Jessica, but the truth, it seemed, still ran deeper. Months later, Pence pieced it together. Thomas Beckett had indeed picked Jessica up that night, but not while she was safe. She had already tried to flee something or someone else. The argument by the dark car, the emergency call, the missing 20 minutes, all pointed toward Marcus Dalton's involvement. Beckett's fatal mistake was trying to play savior or accomplice, depending on what version one believed. When things spiraled, he panicked, silenced Jessica, and took the fall for a moment he barely controlled. The realization landed with a hollow ache. The city had convicted its culprit, but not the only man responsible. The second had died in silence years earlier. Detective Pence wrote her formal conclusion in a new report added to the Monroe file, a supplemental finding acknowledging the likelihood of a secondary assailant connected to Marcus Dalton. It would never see a courtroom. But it mattered. Because truth matters, especially in a city that had learned how long lies can live beneath the water. When she closed the file, Pence looked out the window toward the Spokane River, black and gleaming under the winter moon. The rippling reflection of light traced across its surface like quiet breathing. She thought of Jessica, of Carol Monroe, of everyone who had spent 21 years waiting for answers that came too late. And she whispered to no one in particular, "We found you." Maybe not all of it, but enough. The case was finished. Or at least as finished as a 21-year ghost story could ever be. For the people of Spokane, the truth didn't end with a courtroom verdict or a police report. It lingered, heavy and uncomfortable, casting long shadows over familiar streets. When the final pieces of Jessica Monroe's story were revealed, they didn't bring relief alone. They brought introspection, guilt, and a strange silence that settled over the city like mist. Local media called it a story of two monsters and one tragedy. But in the homes, cafes, and schools of Spokane, the conversation was more personal, quieter. Everyone had their own memory of Jessica, or at least of her case. Some had volunteered in the search. Others had walked those same streets at night, once feeling completely safe. The truth forced them to ask what kind of place they really lived in, a city whose river had taken, hidden, and finally returned a daughter. Detective Laura Pence spent the months after the revelation filling out paperwork, preparing her final report, and giving measured interviews to press that wanted emotion from her she couldn't give. She spoke in facts, keeping her voice composed. But when the microphones clicked off and she was alone at her desk, she stared at Jessica's photograph, the same one used on the original posters, sunlight catching her face, eyes soft, alive. Pence thought of how long the world had kept moving while Jessica remained frozen in time. The Spokane police organized a small memorial event at Cowley Park that summer. It wasn't grand, no banners or politicians, just a circle of chairs, a microphone, and a view of the river. Carol Monroe sat on the front row, her hands clasped together. She wore the same silver necklace her daughter used to borrow, its small locket now scratched from years of use. When it was her turn to speak, the crowd grew completely still. "People tell me justice was done," she said, her voice steady, strong. "But justice doesn't bring my daughter home. Justice doesn't stop me from waking up and reaching for the phone in the morning. Justice is just what's left when love can't fix it." A soft wind brushed through the trees. Beside her, Laura Pence stood silently, holding her police cap against her chest. For the first time, she let herself cry, not loudly, but enough to feel something loosen inside. In the weeks that followed, Spokane came together in small, human ways. The city approved a scholarship fund in Jessica's name for young nurses. The hospital she'd worked at placed a photograph of her in their staff hallway. Students at Spokane Falls Community College wrote essays on victims of forgotten crimes, and hers became the most discussed. But not everyone adjusted easily. Among Jessica's old friends, some still insisted there must be more to the story. Internet forums reignited with speculation, theories that Beckett hadn't acted alone, that Marcus Dalton wasn't the only hidden player. Podcasts covered the case, twisting fragments of evidence into new conspiracies for clicks. Carol avoided them entirely. She told a reporter once quietly, "They took 20 years of her life. I'm not giving them 20 of mine." Meanwhile, for Laura Pence, the case changed something deeper. She had always seen her job as the search for facts, not meaning. But Jessica's case had blurred that line. Finding truth, she realized, wasn't the same as finding peace. Every solved mystery left behind questions that couldn't be answered by fingerprints or DNA. Her career began shifting subtly. She started mentoring younger detectives, teaching classes at the police academy about empathy in investigations, the kind of training that teaches officers how to speak to families, how to hold silence, how to carry stories like Jessica's without letting them swallow you whole. Sometimes, late at night, she revisited the river. She'd park near Peaceful Valley, walk down the slope, and listen, just listen, to the sound of moving water. Once, she found Carol there too, sitting on a bench, watching the current roll past. They didn't need words between them. The water said enough. Do you ever think it forgives? Carol asked one night, eyes fixed on the dark surface. Pence thought for a moment. No, she said, but I think it forgets slower than we do. Carol nodded. Maybe that's why it gave her back. A silence stretched between them, not awkward, but heavy with understanding. In a world of police reports and televised trials, moments like that were rare. Two women, both carrying the same story in different ways, finally finding calm. Months turned into a year. The Monroe Scholarship reached its first recipient, a young nursing student named Talia Raymond. At the ceremony, she read from a letter Carol had written. Let this not be a story of what was lost, but of what we keep passing forward. By then, Beckett had been transferred to the Walla Walla State Penitentiary. He rarely spoke, avoided interviews. In a strange twist, he sent a letter to Carol from prison months into a sentence. It was short, just a few sentences written in messy block print. Asterisk, I can't ask for forgiveness, but I know the truth finally reached you. I didn't start that night with evil in my head, but I end it that way. I am sorry, asterisk. Carol never responded. She tore the letter neatly in half, placed it in Jessica's case box, and closed it for good. Journalists continued to request interviews from both her and Pence, but neither spoke again publicly about the case. They both believed their words belonged to Jessica now, not the world. By late 2022, Spokane changed in subtle, lasting ways. Streetlights were restored along Jessica's walking route. A local law passed expanding resources for missing persons units. And near the river a mural appeared, painted by local artists, showing Jessica's profile emerging from ripples of blue beneath the words, "Truth flows even when buried." Every year on March 4th, candles reappear along the trail she once walked. Some are lit by strangers, some by old volunteers. People stop, not all remembering her name, but remembering the feeling, the ache of something senseless that needed to be made right. Detective Pence retired 2 years later. On her final day, she packed away the objects from her desk, her badge, a stack of notebooks, and one framed photo from 2000 showing her as a rookie standing beside a police cruiser. She paused before turning off the lights. In her drawer, she slipped a small folded note, handwritten in quiet cursive. Asterisk for whoever find this. Don't rush the silence. Sometimes the answer waits years to speak. Asterisk. And then she left, the hallway lights flickering as the door clicked shut behind her. Life in Spokane went on. The river kept running. Buildings rose, neighborhoods changed, faces came and went. But in local memory, Jessica Monroe's story endured, not as tragedy alone, but as a long echo reminding everyone how fragile the boundary between safety and loss really is. Because that's what the Spokane case had become. Not just a crime or even a mystery. It was a mirror, showing a city what it meant to lose someone quietly, and what it takes to finally let them rest. And in that stillness, beneath cold skies and the whisper of water, Spokane learned a truth that would outlast every headline. That closure isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering fully and continuing anyway. In the years following Jessica Monroe's case, something changed inside the Spokane Police Department. What began as a single cold case reopening grew into a quiet movement, one that reshaped how the city looked at its forgotten tragedies. The shock, pain, and persistence surrounding Jessica's story didn't fade. It evolved into conviction. By 2023, the cold case unit that Detective Laura Pence once led had expanded. It started with 3 people. Now it filled 2 full floors of the old precinct annex, staffed by analysts, forensic specialists, and young detectives inspired by the Monroe investigation. The walls were covered with photographs, faces of the missing, copies of old case headlines, and post-it notes connecting time, names, and clues. And on one wall, framed at the center, hung Jessica's photo. Underneath, in small letters, a plaque read, asterisk case closed, 2021. Proof that truth has no expiration date, asterisk. Detective Kyle Anderson, newly assigned to lead the unit, often paused at that wall. He had joined the force in 2004, a rookie, when Jessica's case was already cold. He remembered watching the rerun interviews of Carol Monroe and seeing the word hope written in thick marker across her daughter's picture during the original search. That case taught this city patience, he said to a new recruit one morning. It taught us to look twice. To not assume silence means the end. From the ashes of one solved mystery, others began to surface. Families of long-forgotten victims came forward again, emboldened. Boxes long shelved under unsolved tags were reopened, scanned, and logged into the new digital database. The department partnered with forensics labs across the state, retesting traces forgotten in evidence lockers for decades. It was slow work, painstaking, detail by detail, but it mattered. Even when answers didn't come, the effort itself gave families something to hold on to. The Monroe Foundation, created in Jessica's memory, helped fund this new expansion. Carol Monroe herself became an advocate, speaking not as a grieving mother anymore, but as a voice for those still waiting. In public interviews, she didn't speak much about Beckett or the night everything ended. Instead, she spoke about systems, about persistence, compassion, and the rights of families to never stop asking. Standing before a small crowd at a justice conference, she once said, "Time doesn't bury pain, it buries effort. We have to keep digging until every hand that vanished is accounted for." The room answered with quiet applause, but her eyes never strayed far from the photograph of Jessica on the screen beside her. What surprised many in Spokane was how the community itself responded. High school classes began hosting cold case nights, inviting detectives to talk about unsolved local mysteries. College forensic programs built internships around real investigations. People started sending in old photos, memories, and personal tips, tiny fragments of information that sometimes reopened doors investigators thought were forever sealed. The cold case team began to build a rhythm, one discovery leading to another. In late 2023, a lead from a retired officer reignited a 1994 missing person case. 2 months later, cross-referenced vehicle registrations helped identify another victim long buried, without a name. News stations began their reports differently, inspired by the Monroe breakthrough. But inside the department, those closest to Jessica's case bore a different understanding of what it truly meant. They knew justice was not a victory. It was a responsibility. Detective Anderson kept a recording of Laura Pence's last internal debrief, played occasionally for new recruits. Her voice sounded steady, professional, but it carried the weight of someone who had stared at too much absence. "If you ever think these cases are about catching bad people," she said, "you've already lost perspective. They're about fixing the silence. You dig because someone stopped speaking, and you can't live with that." Her words became the unit's unofficial motto. Outside the department, Spokane began to feel safer again, though differently. It wasn't about trust in a flawless system, but faith in persistence. Community centers held remembrance events for victims from decades apart. People shared stories of old cases as if reviving family histories. The pain was still there, but it no longer hid. Meanwhile, Carol Monroe's home on the outskirts of town became something of a quiet pilgrimage site for families still waiting. Her kitchen filled with letters, mothers, brothers, grandchildren, each one thanking her for reminding them not to give up. She responded to every single one hand-signed, often ending with the same line, *, keep asking. The noise keeps them alive, *. One evening, almost 3 years after Beckett's conviction, Kara received an envelope marked from Walla Walla Penitentiary. She hesitated, but opened it. Inside was a short note, not from Beckett, but from a prison chaplain who had spent time with him. The message read, *, he told me yesterday that every night he dreams of the river. Not the water, but her face by it. He says he thinks of her walking home, calm, unafraid. Thought you should know, *. Carol read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it with the others, not out of forgiveness, but out of the same discipline that had kept her from drowning in grief. Everything, even pain, deserved to be organized, labeled, and understood. That same winter, the cold case unit held a ceremony in the police auditorium, not a celebration, but a remembrance. Families were invited to see photos of loved ones projected across the wall. At the end, Detective Anderson took the stage. He didn't give a speech. He He simply said, "We found one truth because one city decided to stop forgetting. Let's not stop." And the lights dimmed as the wall of photographs reflected across the audience. Hundreds of faces, all waiting for their names to be spoken aloud again. When the room emptied, Anderson walked the hallway alone, his shoes echoing on the tile. He stopped before the wall where Jessica's case file hung. Her face looked the same as it had 23 years earlier, eternally young. He whispered a quiet thank you, not out of duty, but respect. Outside, snow began falling over Spokane. The river moved beneath the bridges, slow and dark, whispering the same endless rhythm it always had. Time had reshaped the city, but the undercurrent of loss and redemption remained. Jessica's story had become part of Spokane's identity. Not a legend, not just a case, but a kind of promise. That truth, no matter how buried, still finds a surface. Years from now, detectives would come and go. Paper files would turn digital, evidence logs would grow vast. Faces on the wall would fade under sunlight. But Jessica Monroe's name would remain, the one thread linking every future answer back to that night in 2000, when a girl walked home and disappeared, changing Spokane forever. And though the city slept most nights in peace, the cold case lights at the precinct never turned completely off, a faint blue glow burning through the dark, waiting patiently for the next story ready to be found. By the spring of 2024, the Spokane Cold Case Unit had entered a rhythm, steady, methodical, efficient. Files once dismissed as hopeless now filled the bulletin boards, pinned with new evidence tags. Analysts spoke in the language of fragments, DNA traces, timeline gaps, environmental aging. But behind every board, there was a story still breathing quietly beneath the dust. Detective Kyle Anderson had been with the unit almost 3 years when the first pattern surfaced. It began subtly, a conversation between two analysts comparing profiles from old databases. Both were reviewing unsolved disappearances of women between 1998 and 2004. At first glance, the cases looked separate, different victims, different trails. Yet something about the geography caught their attention. Same stretch of road, same proximity to the river. By lunchtime, they pulled every archived file from that radius, 15 in total, and placed them side by side on the conference table. The silence in the room grew heavy. Different names, different years, similar circumstances. Women walking home late, vehicles spotted nearby, always within a mile or two of water. Anderson hovered over the files, his jaw tightening. The timeline placed Jessica Monroe's case frighteningly close to the center of it all, not as an outlier, but as the one they'd finally solved. She might not have been the first, he said quietly. She might have been the only one who ever came back. The team spent the next month reconstructing patterns. They used mapping software, weather archives, even bridge maintenance logs, anything that could pinpoint conditions the nights these women disappeared. A data analyst printed a large format map of Spokane covered with red pins marking each disappearance. Under dim office light, it looked like a constellation. When traced chronologically, the line curved south along the river's edge, curiously consistent. They named it internally, the Riverline Pattern. Most of the cases had faded from public memory. Victims whose families had moved away, search groups that had dissolved. But two stood out, Amber Carter in 1998 and Becca Lane in 2003. Both young women mid-20s, vanished while walking home alone after closing shifts. Both near downtown. Both files marked inactive for over a decade. The similarities to Jessica Monroe's case were unsettling. Yet the culprit, Thomas Beckett, was never linked to those specific disappearances. He'd been clear of any suspicion at the time. That fact alone haunted Anderson. If not him, then who? The investigation deepened. Letters were sent to families, evidence reprocessed, and personal items scanned with updated tech. Tiny fibers that once yielded nothing now produced genetic prints. One of those prints, discovered on Amber Carter's scarf, drew a fresh jolt through the department. Female DNA, unknown, unsourced. At first, that didn't fit the pattern. The presence of a woman complicated everything. But as the analysts compared records again, a new hypothesis emerged. Maybe it wasn't one predator. Maybe someone else had been helping cover it up. Detective Megan Shaw, young and relentless, led the evidence retracing. Her analysis revealed something Anderson hadn't noticed before. Every initial report across those years listed a secondary vehicle showing up near the scenes, not always described the same way, but always present. A dark SUV, a blue sedan, a van, all tied by registry patterns to auto auctions Beckett himself had attended while working at the garage. The timeline intersected again. If Dalton and Beckett both worked those auctions, Shaw explained during briefing, they could have had access to temporary tags for cars, vehicles they could use, dump, and never report. It isn't proof, but it's how you stay invisible. Anderson rubbed a hand over his face. You're saying there could have been others, more like them, more than just a single case. That's exactly what I'm saying. It was a theory no one wanted to speak aloud, that Jessica's murder was only one piece of a larger web stretching across years, handled by overlapping hands. Weeks later, a tip came from an unexpected source. An elderly man in Coeur d'Alene named Harold Winters, the same man who'd reported the muffled argument near 5th and Jefferson over 2 decades earlier. He had followed the recent news and called the department himself. I might not have remembered everything right back then, he said over the phone, but I remember the sound of more than one voice. There was a woman too. Lower tone, steady, like she was in charge. When Anderson and Shaw arrived at his small house the next day, Winters led them to his porch facing the street and pointed. She said something like, "Let's keep moving." It chilled me. I still remember it. Then that car door slammed. The detectives exchanged glances. It backed the theory, multiple participants, possibly one woman present the night Jessica vanished. But who? That question led Shaw into Beckett's old employment records again. This time, she looked carefully at names around the Chevron garage where he'd worked. And there it was, a single entry from payroll, supervisor Pamela Reese, hired in 1998, terminated in July 2000. She had disappeared from the system soon after. Anderson stared. "Find her," he said. It took 3 weeks, but they did. Pamela Reese, now 61, living in Montana under a married name. The team arranged quiet surveillance, pulling background data, linking her credit history. Nothing alarming, a retired mechanic now teaching community maintenance classes. But the coincidence was too hard to ignore. Detectives approached her in early June. She didn't run. When questioned, Reese acknowledged knowing Beckett, but denied any involvement. Yet in her garage, carefully shelved, they found a set of license plates wrapped in newspaper from 1999, plates linked to a car registered to one of the missing women, Becca Lane. DNA swabs later revealed traces of Reese's sweat embedded in the plate edges. Confronted with the evidence, Pamela Reese finally spoke. She admitted to helping dispose of Becca Lane's vehicle years ago, but claimed she never harmed anyone. "I was cleaning up after someone else's mess," she told them. "They told me what to do, and I did it." "They?" Anderson asked. "Tom and Marcus," she said softly. "Always those two. But I never touched the girl." Her statement reframed everything. Marcus Dalton, the same brother linked indirectly to Jessica's case, had apparently been connected to Beckett long before 2000. They'd been part of something tighter, coordinated. And Pamela Reese had been the one making it easier to hide, using her garage to recycle vehicle parts, erase trails, and sell replacements quietly across county lines. Though the statute of limitations prevented most charges, her cooperation gave the cold case team something they'd never had before, a complete picture of connection. Not random crimes, a network. In late 2024, Spokane PD held a confidential internal meeting summarizing their findings. Over a dozen suspected linked disappearances across Washington and northern Idaho were traced, supported loosely by overlapping evidence, shared vehicles, and matched DNA fragments too damaged for total confirmation. They labeled the compiled investigation the Riverline cases, after the pattern the city once ignored. When the meeting ended, Anderson stood by the darkened room's window, watching the river flicker under bridge lights. Spokane slept as always, unaware its ghosts were still being counted. Later that night, He drove past Jessica's memorial by Cowley Park. The words carved into the plaque caught headlights, just long enough to glint like whispers. Gone but never forgotten. Anderson pressed a hand against the cold metal surface and spoke into the wind. "We're still digging, Jess. You started this." The river moved quietly below, carrying both memory and guilt, winding through the heart of a city that had learned to listen, finally, to the silence it once drowned out. When news of the Riverline cases finally broke, Spokane felt it in its bones. What had once been a proud story of justice, the end of Jessica Monroe's 20-year mystery, turned overnight into a realization that the nightmare had been larger, quieter, and more organized than anyone ever imagined. The first reports hit on an early morning in September 2024. The Spokane Chronicle's headline read in black print that seemed almost accusatory. Asterisk, linked disappearances suggest decades-long pattern along river. Asterisk, within hours, television crews crowded near the police station, and by noon, cable networks picked it up across Washington and beyond. The story wasn't just about one girl anymore. It was about what her death had revealed. Downtown coffee shops stopped serving for a few minutes as radios played the updates. People who remembered 2000 said it was like watching history repeat itself, only this time with the curtain ripped down completely. New names filled the air: Amber Carter, Becca Lane, and others whose faces Spokane had forgotten until that morning's paper printed them side by side. Detective Kyle Anderson didn't appear on camera that day, or any day after. The department held a single press conference. Chief of Police Dana Herrera spoke carefully, her words steady, composed, but heavy. Evidence suggests several cases between 1998 and 2000 are connected through vehicle records, forensic material, and witness statements. We believe multiple individuals were involved, including some previously deceased. While no further prosecutions may be possible, these families deserve truth, and we intend to give them closure. Behind her, the faces of the missing were projected, 15 in total. Rows of people stood outside the department watching in stunned silence. When it ended, the crowd didn't cheer or applaud. They just stood longer motionless, trying to absorb how easily horror had hidden in their city. At that exact hour, Carol Monroe sat in her small living room surrounded by letters, dozens of new ones. Journalists, families, people she'd once met at vigils for Jessica, writing now to say the same thing in different words. Your daughter started something no one else could finish. She wasn't watching the live broadcast, but she knew what it said. She could feel it, the way grief multiplies when it finds company. That evening, as the sun set beyond the river, Spokane fell into a strange stillness. Parks emptied early. Stores dimmed their lights. On the bridges, people stopped to look down at the water, as if seeing it differently now, no longer just a symbol of peace, but something ancient, complicit. It had carried all those stories beneath its surface for too long. Inside the cold case unit, the air was tense. Reporters called nonstop. Politicians demanded statements. Somewhere between exhaustion and defiance, the team kept working. The room looked like organized chaos. Files open, markers circling names, maps cross-checked with renewal logs from old vehicle auctions. Anderson knew it would take years to reconstruct everything properly, but that didn't stop him. He wasn't just solving anymore. He was accounting for history. Megan Shaw, his second-in-command, typed up the summary report that would go public. A 52-page document listing every confirmed or suspected link. At the bottom, she wrote one sentence in plain language that spoke louder than anything else. Asterisk, evidence indicates at least one additional unknown accomplice may have facilitated multiple disappearances between 2000 and 2004. Investigation remains ongoing, asterisk. When she read it aloud, Anderson nodded slowly. Good, he said. The public deserves to know it wasn't random. Nothing about this ever was. The release triggered an explosion of reaction. News anchors called it Asterisk, Spokane's Reckoning. Asterisk True Crime Podcast dissected every detail from the leaked files. Former residents returned to revisit old neighborhoods, pointing toward dimly lit streets they used to cross as teenagers. It wasn't just curiosity, it was an awakening. Spokane, once proud of its resilience, had to admit how deeply fear had lived beneath its calm for so long. Church services that weekend were packed. Parents held their children closer on nighttime walks. Neighborhood associations formed patrols, not out of paranoia, but solidarity, a collective effort to prove the city could stand watch again. Store owners placed ribbons in their windows, each one representing a victim still unnamed. Meanwhile, Carol Monroe found herself on camera again, reluctantly drawn into interviews she had never wanted. When asked if she felt vindicated, she shook her head. "Justice isn't satisfaction," she said softly. "It's the bare minimum of truth. The rest is mourning." Her words were replayed endlessly across state broadcasts. Letters poured in from across the country, from families of cases in other cities who recognized their own stories in Spokane's. People began sending tips, digging through old memories, urging the police to look deeper. The ripple effect spread far beyond Washington. The Riverline had become a national mirror. For Anderson and Shaw, though, the work became heavier. New leads meant old bodies. Search teams returned to the banks and woodlets along the Spokane River. Every discovery forced them to reopen wounds, to reimagine moments lost to time. They marked each recovery point on a shared map, small blue marks stretching like veins through the city's core. Late nights turned quiet. They rarely spoke anymore unless necessary. One evening, long after midnight, Anderson sat at his desk, the office empty except for the humming of computer screens. He reread the Monroe file yet again, page after page, name after name, statement after statement. 24 years compressed into ink and paper. Somewhere inside all that documentation, somewhere between Jessica's first photo and Beckett's mugshot, he found his reflection in the glass. He wondered privately if anyone should ever feel proud of solving things like this. Because every answer brought back something broken, and every truth stripped another layer of comfort away from the city he swore to protect. Then came a phone call. It was Megan Shaw, her voice low, electrified with urgency. "Kyle, we just got something from Montana. Reese's old property. Ground radar scans showed a buried vehicle on her farmland. It's been there for decades." He closed his eyes. "Another one?" "Maybe more than that," she said quietly. The plates trace back to a Pullman resident. Disappeared in 2003. That meant the story wasn't over. Even after all the press, even after all the faces on screens and all the confessions, there were still cars resting under dirt and time. Still women, without names, waiting to be found. Anderson grabbed his coat, looked once more at Jessica's framed photo on the wall, and whispered, "We're not done." By dawn, he was on the road to Montana. Headlights cutting through fog. The same river that ran past Spokane stretched westward beside him, winding like a witness that refused to stop speaking. The world around him stayed dark, but he could feel the pulse of something beneath it, a quiet plea echoing through the land, reminding him that peace was temporary when truth kept rising from underneath. In the morning papers, another headline was waiting to be written, and Spokane, once again, would hold its breath. The drive from Spokane to rural Montana was long and quiet. Highway, hills, and long stretches of nothing but pine and sky. Detective Kyle Anderson barely spoke during the journey. The car's radio stayed silent. His mind kept circling one thought. How many secrets could a lifetime hide beneath the earth before it finally gave one back? By the time he reached the old farmland once owned by Pamela Reese, dawn had broken. Morning frost clung to the grass, and a team of Montana State Troopers already stood near a fenced-off patch of soil, disturbed by digging machines. In the distance, a backhoe idled beside a shallow trench. Its operator waved as Anderson stepped out of the car, the cold air biting through his jacket. Megan Shaw met him halfway between the vehicles and the dig site. There were deep circles under her eyes. She'd been on site since the previous night. "You should see this," she said quietly, handing him a folded tarp sheet covered in photographs. They showed the outline of a rusted car being unearthed piece by piece, its body held together only by the strength of mud. The plates matched the Pullman case. Anderson asked. Shaw nodded. "Registered to Rachel Whitmore." Vanished June 2003. Fits. She hesitated, lowering her voice. There's more. The forensic scan shows it's not just one car. There's something else, smaller. Parallel ditch. Could be another vehicle. Or maybe a shallow grave. Anderson looked toward the excavation site. The field stretched out, beautiful and cruel in the way quiet places always are. Pamela Reese had lived out here for more than 2 decades. Her closest neighbor almost a mile away. It was perfect, isolation disguised as peace. When the digging resumed, the machine's bucket hit metal with a hollow thud, the kind that makes a crowd freeze. Workers switched to hand tools immediately, brushing away earth, careful, gentle. As the outlines took shape, it became clear. The second object wasn't a car. It was a smaller structure, more like an oil drum, sealed with concrete around the rim. A makeshift coffin. The next few hours blurred into organized chaos. Photographers documented every stage. Forensics bag samples. Reporters started circling nearby roads, waiting for confirmation. By noon, the car's interior had been cleaned enough to reveal bones in the driver's seat, preserved, posture locked in terror. DNA tests would later confirm what everyone already suspected. Rachel Whitmore had finally been found. The drum remained sealed until late afternoon. When investigators opened it, the air filled with the smell of rust and silence. Inside were fragments of fabric and partial skeletal remains, smaller than expected, suggesting someone younger. Closer inspection showed they weren't linked to the Pullman disappearance. This was another victim. That discovery forced Anderson's hand. He ordered a search of the entire property. Over the next 2 days, cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar revealed 3 more burial points along the rear edge of the lot. Reese's farm was a graveyard, a holding ground for Spokane's missing. When she was brought in for questioning again, Pamela Reese's calm facade cracked. The woman who once spoke in even tones now trembled as she faced the photos of the excavation. "I didn't bury them," she said in a weak voice. "They came here already gone. They told me it was better this way. Less noise." "They?" Anderson pressed. "Marcus," she whispered. "And the others. They handled the girls before I ever saw them. I was just supposed to keep it quiet, clean the trail. I swear, I never hurt anyone. I didn't even know how many there were." Her words confirmed the unspoken. Jessica Monroe had been one of several cases intertwined by the same web, connected not just by proximity or opportunity, but by a system of silence, men who hunted, and one woman who made the evidence disappear. Anderson left the room shaken. Justice seemed meaningless now. The people responsible were dead or dying, their names fading with each confession, each file. But the truth, the ugly, inescapable truth, was now complete. And that, in its own strange way, was enough. The following week, as detectives cataloged the remains, the names of 5 previously unsolved women's cases were officially linked to the Riverline network. Headlines returned, louder this time, but different. No accusations. No speculation. Just grim finality. Spokane's dark history had spilled past its borders, ending here, in the frozen soil of Montana. When Anderson gave his final statement to reporters, he refused to dramatize the discovery. His words were simple, direct. It began with one case. It ends with the truth buried here. Every victim now has a name. That's all that matters. In Spokane, the news washed over the city like the slow turn of a tide. Candlelight vigils filled parks again. Citizens left flowers along the riverbanks, not for one girl, but for all who had been lost. Murals expanded beside the one of Jessica Monroe. 15 new portraits painted across the same brick wall. Above them, a single phrase in white paint: "The river remembers." For Carol Monroe, closure came quietly. She visited the wall one evening just after sunset, when the air smelled faintly of rain. The colors glowed under streetlights, faces illuminated in muted blues and violets, each expression peaceful, finally found. She brought no candles this time, only a folded photograph of Jessica and herself from years before. She placed it at the base of her daughter's painted likeness and whispered, "You can rest now, sweetheart. They're all home." That same night, Detective Anderson drove out one last time to the Spokane River. He parked near the water's edge, where the sound had always been constant, steady. The reflection of bridge lights cut across the current like veins of memory. He stood on the bank for a long time, letting the wind bite through him, the smell of pine and cold stone filling his chest. In his hand was Jessica's case file, now officially marked closed forever, full resolution obtained. He set it down on the bench overlooking the river, its corners fluttering lightly in the breeze before settling flat. The work was done. The city could finally exhale. Above him, the stars broke through thin clouds, their reflections trembling across the dark surface below. Somewhere in that moving mirror lay 25 years of grief, persistence, and truth reclaimed from silence. Anderson whispered into the cold night, not to anyone living, but to everyone gone, "We found you." He turned, walked up toward his car, and didn't look back. The sound of the river followed him, winding through rock and brush like a soft voice that never stopped speaking. The same voice that had anchored the entire story from the beginning. Not justice, not redemption, just the steady endurance of truth. In the years that followed, Spokane thrived again. The schools used the Monroe case as part of forensic curricula. The cold case unit became a model for nationwide reform. The Riverline Network was cited in criminology journals, studied not for its horror, but for the persistence that ended it. And every March 4th, people gathered quietly by Cowley Park as the city lights flickered over the water, remembering not the tragedy, but the courage it took to uncover it. Because that is how the Spokane 2000 case truly ended, not with applause or closure, but with a city forever changed by its own reckoning. The river still ran where it always had, but now everyone in Spokane knew what it carried. It wasn't just water, it was witness. And now, finally, it was free.
For years, these cases were forgotten. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Here we reopen the files, reveal the evidence, and give a voice to those who were silenced. Subscribe now and step inside the archive where time, lies, and justice finally meet. Because every secret eventually speaks.